Okay, I'm just recording this meeting. So if you imagine that this is our macroeconomic equilibrium between a demand and a supply, then we need to find out what are the factors affecting this demand side, what are the factors affecting this supply side, so that we can know how can we reach the macroeconomic equilibrium. We discussed the aggregate expenditure side by saying that we can call it aggregate expenditure. Later on, we just changed the name and call it aggregate demand when we start to link it with the price. And we said it has basically four main components: C plus I plus G plus net exports. And this model is static because it assumes prices are fixed. Okay, so prices are fixed in this model, and then towards the end of the topic, or towards the end of chapter 12, we started to break the assumption of price being constant. Each one of these has its own factors, right? So we said that consumption is a function of how much I earn after I pay taxes, disposable income, wealth, also expected income or expected disposable income. The price level affects my decision to consume, and also interest rate, right? So those are mainly the 5 variables affecting consumption. Of course, if I have more income, I'll consume more. If I have more wealth, then I'll consume more. If I expect more income to come next month, it all depends, as I told you. I can hold my consumption today waiting for tomorrow. So this can be negative. Or I can consume today more, knowing that I will recover this income tomorrow, right? So it all depends. It's a personal choice. So you can always explain it in terms of a negative relationship or a positive relationship, or actually no relationship. So you can have, and you can expect income next month and then just do nothing. You just like have your regular pace of your consumption unaffected. Prices, as you know, the higher the prices, the lower the consumption. And interest rate, the higher the interest rate, the lower the consumption. Why? Because my disposable income, which is the income after I pay taxes, I allocate between consumption and savings. If the interest rate increases, then I'm going to switch from consumption to savings because I'm earning more dollars. So the higher the interest rate, the higher my incentive to reduce consumption, because I can earn more money by allocating my consumption to savings. Okay, that's why we have it as a negative relationship. For the prices, I want you to know that it has a direct impact on consumption, right? But it also has an indirect impact through its effect on your wealth, through its effect on, or I should say, real wealth, right? So through its effect on real wealth, through its effect on real income. So you can think of the impact of prices is directly affecting consumption, right? But it also indirectly affecting it through the real wealth. So this is called real wealth. Okay, or real income, real disposable income. So the higher the price, the lower the real income. The higher the price, the lower the real wealth. And in both cases, it will lead to a lower consumption. So remember that prices has a direct and also has an indirect effect on consumption. For investment, it has its own function. Any question before I proceed? If you have any question, just stop me, either unmute yourself and ask me the question, right? I prefer to do it this way because sometimes when you type in the chat, I don't see it while I'm looking at my iPad. So just unmute yourself and ask a question. For investment, it has its own variables. So of course, if you are an investor, then future profit would have an impact on your investment decisions. Interest rate, assuming that you're getting a loan from the bank, taxes, corporate taxes or capital gains taxes affects your decision cash flow, which is the revenue minus expenses. Of course, there are other factors, but we're just focusing on these. So the higher the expected profit, of course, you would take the decision of making the investment. The higher the cost of borrowing from the bank, of course, lowers your investment spending. The higher the taxes, whether corporate or capital gains tax, reduces your investment spending. The higher the cash flow, right, which is a good incentive for you to take this investment decision, then it would be also a positive impact. All right, so these are mainly the factors affecting investment. Government spending, it's all about the fiscal policy. So this one in chapter 16, we discuss government spending in details. Net exports is a function of my prices in the US over the prices in other countries, the growth in the US over the growth in other countries, the exchange rate between the US and the other countries' currency. And in order to understand the connection between these, so you basically think of it as the higher the prices in the US, so prices are relatively expensive in the US as compared to the prices of goods in the other country. So the demand for our exports, it's going to fall. So this leads to a reduction in net exports. So this has a negative relationship. The higher the prices in the US, the lower the demand for our products. So net exports decreases. The higher the growth in the US, you can think of growth as income. So the higher the income in the US relative to the income in the other country, so we are demanding more, we are importing more. So this decreases net exports. Remember, this one was exports minus imports. And exchange rate, which is the value of the dollar versus the value of other currency. So as the value of the dollar increases, let's say $1 used to be equal to 100 yen. Now the dollar is equal, let's say, to 130 yen. So for us as people living in the US, for us, our dollar can get more. So we have an incentive to buy more from other countries. And the opposite is true for the other countries, or the other, I mean, like Japan, I should say in this example. For Japanese people, our products are relatively more expensive. They used to pay only $100 yen to get the dollar. Now they have to pay more, 130 yen to get a dollar. So our products are becoming expensive. And this again decreases our exports and in turn decreases net exports. So according to this link, or I should go back, according to all these variables that are affecting aggregate demand, I want you to imagine that any changes in any of these factors, whether these factors affecting consumption side or affecting the investment side or affecting the net export side, has an impact on aggregate demand. So any change here would be reflected in aggregate demand. Okay, so and it will also affect, if demand changes, then also prices will change. So you can think of the changes in aggregate demand, right, will lead to changes in production and also changes in prices. Okay, chapter 12 is just focusing on this link, which is the static link. No change in static link, no change in prices. So it assumes that prices are fixed throughout this chapter. But then again, towards the end of the chapter, we start to break this assumption. So for example, out of this link that we have above, we want to get an equilibrium. Aggregate demand is equal to real GDP. We want to get a macroeconomic equilibrium, okay? And we represented this macroeconomic equilibrium by a graph, which has on this side, I remember I told you you can call it aggregate demand or you can call it aggregate expenditure, but I want to keep the same name that you have on your graph. So aggregate expenditure and real GDP. We have a 45-degree line, which is very important, which is called the Keynesian Cross. What is a Keynesian Cross? Any point on this 45-degree line, you have whatever variable on the x-axis is equal to the variable on the y-axis. So it's a line of equilibrium, and it's called the Keynesian Cross because Keynes is the one who kind of like created this graph. So it's called like according to his name. So we said that it's a 45-degree line, right? And this 45-degree line helps us to kind of visualize the equilibrium between demand and supply in the macroeconomy. So we have like a 45-degree line, but we also have the aggregate expenditure that has consumption. We also have an aggregate expenditure line that has consumption and investment. We have also the aggregate expenditure line that has consumption, investment, and government spending, right? And we have the last one, which is the aggregate expenditure line that has everything. G plus net exports. Each jump here is because of a change in the variable, right? So each time we go parallel above the original aggregate demand line, it's because of an increase in one of the variables or in one of the components of the aggregate expenditure. But I want you to notice that, let's take just the very first one. So this point and this point, right? So if you imagine that this shift, right, or this jump from here to here is because of the change in investment. So if I assume that change in investment is equal to 100, then I have 100 shift everywhere, right? I have a jump from C to C plus I by the 100, which is parallel to the original line, which is C. So if you call this jump 1 to 2, so it's like 2 minus 1 would be equal to 100, right? The distance between 0.2 and 0.1 is equal to the change in investment. It's equal to 100, let's say 100 billions. But I also have a change in real GDP. So I want you to imagine that this point to this point, it's like 1 to 3, right? So I'm moving from here to here is equal to the change in real GDP. So we discussed the difference between 2 minus 1 or 0.2 minus 1 is always less than the distance between 3 minus 1. Can anybody tell me why? Why the distance between 1 and 2, which is due to change in investment, for example, right, is always smaller than the distance 3 minus 1? Anybody? I can make it nicer for you. It's like this. Aggregate expenditure, real GDP, right? I have the first line, which is C. I have the Keynesian cross, and I have C plus I. I want you to imagine that from here to here, it's 1 to 2. From here to here is 1 to 3. So 2 minus 1 is the change in investment. 3 minus 1 is the change in real GDP. Why we have the change in real GDP is bigger, right, than the change in investment? It's an easy question. Even, do you have an answer? Kate, do you have an answer? How about Alex?
I'm not sure.
Okay, how about Zain? Don't you remember what we called about the multiplier? So we spoke about the multiplier and we said any change in aggregate demand would lead to changes in real GDP, but bigger changes. Okay, so we said we have the idea of the multiplier. The multiplier is basically, it's like a $1 change in investment would lead to more than $1, right? In change in real GDP. So if the multiplier is 5, the $1 change in investment would lead to $5 change in GDP. So when we discussed the multiplier, we said that we have 4 different multipliers, and the 4 different multipliers would depend on which variable is changing. So in other words, if we are talking about, let's say, we have the aggregate expenditure, C plus I plus G plus net exports. So we have what we call a closed economy multiplier that deals with these variables, and we have also an open economy multiplier. So we said that we have 4 different multipliers that would affect the relationship between any change in the autonomous part. Remember, we said autonomous part, which is the part that doesn't depend on income. So if we open consumption, consumption has a part that is fixed, but it has a part that depends on income, right? Or we can write it as income, like it doesn't have to be disposable income, just let's write it as income, and plus the government spending. I forgot the investment. Oh, sorry, I forgot the investment. Plus the investment plus G plus net exports, right? All of these are called autonomous spending. What is autonomous spending? The part of the variable that does not depend on income. And we said that we have only just one part that depends on income. When you check the different types of multipliers, the different parts of multipliers would be like this. What is the change in real GDP is equal to the multiplier times the change in autonomous spending. The autonomous spending could be consumption, could be investment, could be government spending, and could be net exports, any one of these. So you can just remove this word, this 2 words, and write whatever depending on the question that you have. For this one, we said we have 4 important types of multipliers. It ranges from the very simple one that is equal to 1 over 1 minus MPC, right? And we called this one the closed economy multiplier. And then we had the other one, which is a closed economy again, but it has a lump sum tax. So minus MPC over 1 minus MPC. And we called this one the tax multiplier. So this is a tax multiplier. And again, it's a closed, you can also add the word closed economy, because we still assume that this economy does not have exports or imports. So it's a closed economy tax multiplier. And remember, we use this one when the question is about a lump sum tax. In other words, the government is giving us a check with a certain amount of money. So it's not like a rate, it's not a tax rate, it's just a money back. And then we also have another multiplier, which is the government spending multiplier. And this one is used if you have a question about the tax rate. So you have a government that is using taxes to affect real GDP. But this one is, again, closed economy and government multiplier. But we use this one if we have a tax rate, like the question has a certain percentage about the tax rate. When I say lump sum, then it's a certain amount of dollars that it's given. Let's say if it is a tax holiday, a tax break, then it's giving you a certain amount of dollars back. And then the last type, which is the open economy multiplier. So if you have a question and it's telling you that the economy is exporting and importing or something like that, you would expect to see the marginal propensity to import. So this one would be like 1 over 1 minus MPC. It's like you're repeating the previous one, but you're just adding the last part, which is the minus the MPI. And this one, we call it the open economy multiplier. And notice that it's a T here, like this one. So it's again has a tax rate. All right. I wanted to remember that sometimes a question can be simple actually by asking you that a tax multiplier that is something like that. It can actually ask you that what is the change in real GDP, and you know that it's equal to whatever the multiplier times the change in taxes, for example, right? So the question can give you this number, and ask you about this number. So write it down. So like whenever you see a question in words, write it down so that you can figure out what the question is asking you about. Or it might be like giving you a multiplier and asking you to get the multiplier and RGDP and asking you to get the change in taxes, or giving you the change in taxes multiplier and asking you to get the change in real GDP. But what is important here is any of these multipliers, right? So those are 4 different types of multipliers. They are all having the same actually idea. When you go up here, they are doing the same thing. So if I move from 0.1 to 0.3, 0.1 to 0.3 has an intermediate point, which is 0.2. What is 0.2 is the change in the autonomous spending. This change in autonomous spending is, let's say, we're saying that investment changed by $50, then everywhere along this 2 lines, between these 2 lines is $50. But the impact on the economy is here, which is going to be the 50 times the multiplier. So you multiply the 50. If the multiplier is 2, then the distance here would be 100. Okay, so there is a difference between the change in the autonomous spending, let's say 50, and if the multiplier is 2, then this one would be, let's say, 100. And you can apply this not only to investment, but also to if this is government spending. If this is government spending, right? And then you need to figure out what kind of economy is this. Is it government spending and the economy is open? Is the economy is closed and whatever? Like you have to read and determine which type of multiplier you are using. All right. Any question? So when we are like, we have this real GDP, like supply, and the aggregate expenditure, the demand side, right? And we have the 45-degree line, which is the Keynesian Cross. And we have all these different, like the C, then the C plus I, the C plus I plus G, and then the very last one, which is the C plus I plus G plus net exports, which is the last one, which is the aggregate expenditure. This point is the macroeconomic equilibrium, right? So it's a short-run analysis because this could be before or after the potential GDP. So there is a third line that we need to add. So the third line that we need to add, just let me write this nicer. So the third line that we need to add is like the potential GDP, right? So this is, we call the potential real GDP. It's like the point that you want to reach in order to reach the long run equilibrium. So if you have a question telling you that real GDP is here, potential GDP is here, assuming that this point is 90 billion, but this one is 100 billion. So if the potential real GDP is higher than the actual real GDP, this one is 90, this one is 100. So we want to do everything to increase this 90 so that we can reach the long run equilibrium. Okay, so this 90 is below the potential capacity of the economy. We want to push this 90 more higher, right, to reach the full capacity, to reach the potential GDP. I told you the potential GDP, we can call it the full employment GDP, right? You can call it the natural rate of unemployment, okay? So either or, you can call it the long run macroeconomic equilibrium. So any of these, and this is actually the point that we want to reach. So looking at this graph and looking at a point of this equilibrium, chapters 16 or chapters 15 and 16 are about the monetary and fiscal policy. They are trying to find out what are the tools they have in order to reach the potential GDP, in order to push this aggregate demand upwards so that it intersects with the 45-degree line as well as the potential GDP. So moving from here to here is important because you want to close the gap between the actual GDP and the potential level or the full employment level. All right. So before we discuss the monetary and fiscal policy, as I told you, towards the end of this aggregate demand and aggregate supply analysis, we start to break the assumption of price stability. Okay, so we start to figure out, okay, how can prices affect the economy? So we know that as prices change, like if we break this assumption of price being constant, if price change, or let's take an example as the price increases, it affects the whole economy, right? It has multiple effects on the economy. And in order to understand how it affects the economy, look at here. As the price change, how the change in the price affects the components of aggregate expenditure, how it affects C, how it affects I, how it affects net exports. And I'm not going to say how it affects G, because G, we assume that it's a government decision. So if prices increase, as we said before, it has a wealth effect, right? So it affects consumers. As my prices increases, my real wealth decreases. So it reduces the value of assets, the value of buildings, the value of cash that you have in your pocket, everything. So as prices increases, real wealth decreases. In other words, if my real income or real wealth decreases, consumption also decreases, right? And if consumption decreases, then it leads to a reduction in aggregate expenditure. The other impact it has is on interest rate. So we call it the interest rate effect. So we have the wealth effect. The number two, we have the interest rate effect. As price increases, we have what we call the demand for money. I need more money in order to be able to buy the same amount of goods I have or I used to buy. So as price increases, the demand for money exceeds the supply of money. And if the demand for money exceeds the supply of money, interest rate would go up, right? And this is based on this analysis that we had on the money market, where we have here, this is the quantity of money or the quantity of loanable funds, or you can call it the quantity of money, and this is the interest rate. And we said we have the money supply, straight line, vertical. We have the demand for money, MD. But if the demand for money increases because I need more money in order to be able to buy the same amount of goods I used to buy, then I have a shift upwards in the demand for money to MD prime. Interest rate used to be here. Now it's here. So interest 1, interest 2. We have an increase in the interest rate, right? So as the interest rate increases, I want you to remember that, I want you to remember how interest rate affects your aggregate expenditure. So as interest rate increases, consumption falls, investment falls, leading to a fall in aggregate expenditure. Or we can call it aggregate demand. Also, as price increases, it has an international trade effect. The international trade effect, which is the price of the US versus the price of other countries. As the prices in the US increases, right, our goods becomes relatively expensive, then net exports decreases. If net exports decreases, then aggregate expenditure decreases. So you can look at these different channels by saying, I have a negative relationship between price and aggregate demand or aggregate spending. And this reduction in aggregate spending can come from the real wealth effect, the interest rate effect, or the international trade effect. So we can summarize this link between the negative relationship between aggregate expenditure, or you can call it aggregate demand, and the prices by drawing this graph and saying that if we put here our aggregate demand and this is the price, we can create an aggregate demand curve that has a negative relationship between prices and aggregate demand. As prices increase, aggregate demand falls. So it's a negative relationship between aggregate demand and prices. In other words, you can write that aggregate demand is a function of prices, whereas prices increase, aggregate demand decreases. Why? Because of the fall in the different components of aggregate demand that depends on prices. So the fall in consumption, the fall in investment, the fall in net exports would be reflected in a fall in aggregate demand. So each and every point on the aggregate demand curve, right, reflects different combinations between price and aggregate demand, and it's a negative relationship. All right. So this different links between aggregate demand and aggregate supply is all, the aggregate demand and the price, like everything that we've been discussing so far is from the demand side, which is very important. But also the supply side is important as well. So if we look at the supply side of the economy, like any demand for any good, demand for X, and the price of X, it's a market, right? So you have to also consider the supply of X, because the interaction between demand and supply would determine the price. So whatever we have been like discussing is all related to this link, right? It's all related to the link between demand and price. But we also have the supply side. The supply side is the short-run aggregate supply, but we also have the long-run aggregate supply. And you can think of the long-run aggregate supply, it's like potential real GDP. It's the full employment real GDP, okay? So the short-run aggregate supply has factors that affects it, like you as a supplier, right? You as a firm, affected by so many variables. One of them is the availability of workers. So how many workers I have. So labor is an important factor affecting your supply decisions or your production decisions. Of course, more workers, more supply, right? Holding everything constant. So every time you're discussing one link between one variable and the other, you just assume that all other factors are held constant, because it gets so complicated, right? So I cannot say what happens when the labor increases and wages increases. Then I would have two variables moving at the same time. So to make your life simple, in economics, we assume that each variable in a turn, right? We evaluate each variable in a turn. So when workers or the number of workers increases, then also the production increases, right? So this is one of the factors, but also the quality of workers has an impact on production. So you can call it productivity or technology. Productivity, how much each of these workers can produce per hour. If I have two workers, one worker in 1 hour can produce just 1 unit, but I have another worker that can produce 10 units. So productivity matters, because more productive, more efficient workers implies less number of workers being employed. So if I consider productivity and holding the number of workers constant, the higher the productivity, the higher the supply. So it has a positive impact or positive relationship on the supply. Also, we discussed the expected price. You as a producer, you're expecting some changes in the prices in the future. But notice that as the expected price increases, you also would expect wages to go up, because workers would see this expectation, and this is what we have discussed in our last topic on Tuesday, the link between expected prices and wages. So you as a worker, making your rational expectations, seeing prices going up or expecting prices to go up, you will ask for higher wages. And assuming that wages can go up smoothly, like responding to the expected prices, as wages increases, cost of production also increases. So that means as the cost of production increases, then the supply would increase, so supply would fall. So we expect a negative relationship between the expected increase in the price and the production or the supply. Why? Because it goes through the labor market, and how the labor market or the price of workers affects the cost of production, and in turn affects the availability of the ability of firms to produce. It's not only the expected prices that we discussed on Tuesday, we also discussed the adjustment mechanism, right? So we have an adjustment about the expected prices. So we have expected prices and we have adjustment to expected prices. So for example, workers are expecting a certain price, but it turns out to be the case that the actual price was higher than their expectation. So if the actual price turns out to be higher than their expectations, they would expect a higher price. In other words, if they adjust wages upwards to catch up with the increase in the prices, then it's again would lead to a more drop in the supply. So again, it has a negative impact. And for here, you can refer to our Tuesday topic, how the adjustment in expectations, again, based on rational expectations, can affect the cost of production and accordingly the amount of goods being produced. And our last variable, which is the supply shock, right? Of course, the supply shock can be negative or positive, but let's take it in the negative side. If, for example, the price of oil increases, the price of any natural resources increases. As the price of natural resources increases, your ability to produce would go down, production would decrease. Price of oil, price of any other natural resources, price of wood, for example, to make tables and so on, has a negative impact on the supply. So these are basically the factors that affect the supply side. And notice that I'm talking about supply side. I didn't actually differentiate between a short run or a long run because they both share the same factors. So just repeat those factors for the long run aggregate supply curve, because the factors that affect my short run production are the same factors that also affect the long run production. And based on our analysis of the aggregate demand curve, like this one, we can add to it the short run aggregate supply and also the long run aggregate supply. So we can complete the graph by saying that, okay, we know that the price is always here. It's a price level. It's not the inflation. It's the price level, the price index. And we have here the real GDP. When I say real GDP, it's kind of a summary to two parts, a demand and a supply, whether we're talking about aggregate demand or whether we're talking about the short run aggregate supply or the long run aggregate supply, right? It's like if you have taken microeconomics before, this one we used to call it Q. Nobody tells you, okay, is this Q is about the demand or is this Q is about the supply, right? We used to write QD and QS. And this is for those people who have taken micro class. In macro class, we call this is Q. Our Q is real GDP. And the real GDP can either a demand side or two components or two types, I should say two types of a supply side. But in any case, we just, from the previous slide, we had the aggregate demand. From this function up here, we know that as prices increases, you would supply more. So we have the short run aggregate supply. As prices increases, a good incentive for producers to produce. And we have also the potential GDP or the long run aggregate supply. So the long run aggregate supply, we hope that we would get the intersection of the three lines at one, like at this point. So this point is the point, it's kind of the optimal point. It's the point of macroeconomic equilibrium. Okay, so we hope that we can reach this point. And out of this point, you can actually have so many dynamics in the model. What about if I have a shift in aggregate demand, how it affects the prices? What about if I have a shift in aggregate supply, how it affects the prices? What is the magnitude of the shift would affect the prices? So just an example, if I have an increase in aggregate demand, right, I know that prices would go up, right? If I have an increase in aggregate supply or the short run aggregate supply, I know that prices would go down, okay? Because when the supply increases, prices would go down to adjust the market back to equilibrium. right? So if I have these two, which one would be the final effect on prices? The final effect on prices would depend on which one is bigger, on which one is stronger, right? So if I have just an example, if the aggregate demand, just an example, okay? If the aggregate demand shifts here, it increases, it shifts upwards, and it could shift upward because of one of the factors here. So you look back here, and okay, it can shift upwards because of any of these things. So suppose I have an increase in investment that leads to an upward shift in aggregate expenditure and is reflected in aggregate demand. So if I have an increase in aggregate demand, the prices would go up, right? So this is P1. And suppose that the original one was like here, P0, right? And suppose I have an increase in aggregate supply. So I'm just making an assumption, okay? So suppose the increase in aggregate supply is very small. So short-run aggregate supply shifts, but it's a small shift. So my new equilibrium point would be at the intersection between the two new lines, the red and the blue lines. So it would be here, right? So in other words, the final destination of the price would be higher than the original one. Why? Because the positive impact on, or the increase in the price exceeds the decrease in the price. So finally, we have an increase in the price level from the original point. So the magnitude of the shift of aggregate demand versus aggregate supply would have an impact on the final price. So just to summarize this, so we said that the increase in aggregate demand leads to an increase in the price. But if this increase in the aggregate demand is bigger than the increase in the short-run aggregate supply, which leads to a drop in the price, then the increase in the price is bigger than the fall in the price, then the final effect would be an increase in the price. Okay? We can also have so many stories out of this dynamic relationship between aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So let's see, for example, just I'm going to show you something. So in chapter 13, when we were discussing this aggregate demand and aggregate supply, when we go to one of the graphs, this one, right, showing us a short-run analysis and how we can reach a long-run equilibrium. So again, this graph was like easy because it's showing us that aggregate demand shift is almost equal to the aggregate supply shift. So for example, in this graph, we had a movement from A to B for any reason, right? It could be an increase in investment, consumption, government spending, anything. So this shift in aggregate demand for any reason would lead to an increase in aggregate supply. But the fall in aggregate supply would lead to another, right, increase in the price. I want you to imagine that as aggregate demand increases, we move from point A to B. And point A to B implies that we have an increase in the price from 115 to 118. But as price increases, workers start to adjust their expectations. So they start to say, oh, we expect more prices. We expect prices to go up more. And that means we should ask for higher wages. And as wages increase, cost of production increase. And this implies production decrease. So we fall from production of 20.3 all the way to just 20, which is good because you want to go back to the potential GDP. So you move, in other words, from point B back to C until you reach the potential GDP. So it's like you're moving this way and then up this way until you go back from point A to point B, which is, yes, a potential GDP, but at a higher price level. So this is related to topic 12 or chapter 17 that we finished last Tuesday when we were discussing the role of expectations, okay? And in this topic, I want you to check all the graphs because it's very important how the variables that we have discussed affects the dynamics between demand and supply and affects the price level, okay? Okay, so let's go back to our main outline. So what we have been discussing so far is just the short run, the long run, the dynamics between prices. But in order to discuss how the government or the Fed can manipulate the aggregate demand, we need to discuss the money, banks, and the role of the Fed. So when you look at the Fed or the monetary policy in general, or actually the fiscal policy as well, they can affect aggregate demand. If they can affect aggregate demand, then they can affect prices, right? And if they can affect prices, then they can affect unemployment or output, right? So you can think of it this way. Prices is a function of aggregate demand. Aggregate demand is a function of interest rate. And then interest rate is a function of money supply, right? So anytime the money supply increases or decreases or changes, it affects interest rate, right? Decreases interest rate, it leads to an increase in aggregate demand through the components that are affected by interest rate, right? And it leads to an impact on the economy. So you can say output, right? It can affect output. It can affect, right? It can affect the prices. It can affect unemployment. We know that there is a negative relationship between these two through what we call the Phillips curve. The Phillips curve that we discussed in chapter 17, right? And anytime you talk about unemployment, just have it in your mind that this is also output. I can always say output anytime unemployment falls. In other words, I'm employing more people, right? So output increases. So the role of the monetary policy or monetary policy can affect the economy through its impact on interest rate. So when you think about this link between interest rate and the economy, we need to talk about the role of money. So we have a money demand and we have the money supply. So the money demand is a function of interest rate, real GDP, prices. And the money supply is a function of the Fed, or you can say monetary policy. Okay, so and that's why we always have the money supply as a vertical line, because we cannot control the factors affecting it. We just wait and the Fed have their meetings and they come up with a certain decision about the interest rate or a certain target level of money growth. So when we discuss this link between these two, right, we said that the relationship between interest rate, which is the price of money, and loanable funds is like this. MD, like any demand is negatively related to its price. And we have a money supply that depends on the Fed. So this is money supply. We don't have any control of it. So it's vertical line. As interest rate increases, right, we expect a negative relationship with money demand. And why? If you forgot this link, as interest rate increases, you have two options: either to keep your money as cash, or you invest in bonds. However, as interest rate on bonds increases, you reduce your demand on money. Okay, so as interest rate goes up, you hold less money, so you hold less cash. Okay, so as interest rate goes up, you hold less cash, or in other words, demand increases on bonds. So you reduce your demand on money. You can think of this one as the demand for money in cash. And then as my income increases, or as real GDP goes up, you demand more money so that you are like using this additional income to buy more goods and services. And also as prices increases, you demand more money so that you can get the same number of goods that you used to buy. Okay, here we cannot say it's a positive or negative. It depends on what kind of policy the Fed is using. So if the Fed is using expansionary policy to increase the money supply in times of a recession, or the opposite, a contractionary policy to reduce the money supply. And it can do so through its impact on reserves. So if you imagine that we have a balance sheet, right? And this is just a commercial bank, any bank. It's not the Fed, so it's any bank. So this is, let's say, a commercial bank, and it has an asset side and it has a liability side, and this is the balance sheet. So the balance sheet on the liability side receives deposits from people. And on the other side, it takes these deposits to divide it either into reserves, or to give it out as loans, or to invest in securities. The reserves can be two types: required reserves or excess reserves. So imagine they received money from people. So people are depositing money here. I'm sorry. So people are depositing money, right? This money will not stay on the liability side. It would go to the reserve side. There is a part that is required by the Fed to keep in the balance sheet, but any additional amount would go to excess reserves, which we hope they have excess. So any excess reserves, they take it and offer it as loans, right? Or they buy securities. And then if you assume that they use it as loans, then these loans would be used by people who took the loan as new deposits, right? And the new deposits would be used as new loans. And the new loans would lead to more deposits and so on. It leads finally to expansion or expanding the money supply. So the money supply would expand. And the expansion of the money supply depends on the money multiplier or the deposit multiplier. So we discussed something called a deposit multiplier, which is equal to 1 over required reserves. Okay, and this deposit multiplier is telling us there is a negative relationship between required reserves, how much the Fed ask banks to hold on their balance sheet. So the higher the required reserves, the lower their ability to make loans, right? And it leads to a reduction in the multiplier. So it's a negative relationship, okay? So the ability of the Fed to affect this part of the balance sheet, or the ability of creating money, depends on so many tools that the Fed can use. We discussed 6 important tools, okay? And I don't think the time would be enough to discuss all of them, but let me remind you of these tools. So we said we have open market operations. So if the Fed wants to expand the economy, right, in times of a recession, expand the economy, in other words, using an expansionary policy, implies buying bonds. If they buy bonds, they actually take this piece of paper and they give the dollars or the amount of money to banks. So banks, they have it in their balance sheet and they can start giving it as loans and they can start creating money. Okay, so this loans, and then we get like the multiplier effect, which would lead to more expansion of the money supply. We also discussed, so these are the tools of the monetary policy. We also discussed the discount policy. So we have an interest rate that is discounted on loans that banks can get from each other. And of course, the lower the interest rate or the lower the discount rate, the higher the ability of creating money. So it's a negative relationship. We hope that they can reduce the discount interest rate so that money creation increases. Okay. Number 3, we also discussed the reserve requirement. Of course, as the reserve requirement decreases, money supply increases. So if you ask the banks to hold 10% of their deposits as reserves instead of 20%, then they are able to loan more of their deposits and they can able to create more money or expand the money supply. Also, we discussed the interest on reserves. And of course, if interest on reserve decreases, then money supply increases because banks have less incentive to hold reserves on their balance sheet because they are earning less interest. Number 5, we discussed the overnight repurchase agreement facility. And it's basically, you have an interest rate on loans that can be provided between banks, and it's repurchase because you can give the loan and then you can repurchase it back. And of course, the higher the interest on these loans, or the lower, I should say, let me keep it lower, okay? So I started by lower, 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 so let's keep the same direction. The lower the interest rate, the higher the money supply. And the last one, which is the term deposit facility. And I want you to imagine that this is like a CD that the banks can buy from the Fed. And of course, the lower the interest on these CDs, the higher the money supply, because you have the incentive to, instead of buying a CD and holding your money with the Fed, why should I do so if interest rate falls? So you have an incentive to loan out the money instead. All right. So in other words, we said that these different tools, like the 6 tools, have one objective, is to affect the money supply, right? So let's take it in a direction of a recession. If the economy is in a recession, then the Fed can use these tools in order to get the economy out of a recession by increasing the money supply. And if the money supply increases, interest rate falls. Why? Because we had it from the loanable funds market. We said that this is the loanable funds. we have this is the interest rate. We have the money supply is just a straight line vertical, and we have the money demand. And if money supply increases, we have a rightward shift from MS to MS prime, and this leads to a fall in interest rate from I to I prime. Okay, so a fall in interest rate, and as you know, once interest rate decreases, aggregate demand would increase. Okay, so we have an increase in aggregate demand, and once aggregate demand increases, the prices would go up. And that's how the Fed can manipulate the aggregate demand through the use of its monetary tools in order to get or reach a certain targeted level of inflation, right? So you can imagine like this link in a different way in times of an expansion, using the same tools in order to reduce the money supply, which would increase the interest rate and decreases aggregate demand. And remember, this aggregate demand is affected by interest rate because interest rate affects the consumption, the investment, the net exports, right? So anytime interest rate falls, then consumption increases, investment increases, net exports increases, leading to an increase in aggregate demand. Shift the aggregate demand towards the right, prices would go up. But the final impact on the price would depend on the other component, which is the aggregate supply. So the dynamic relationship between these two would determine the final impact on the price, as I showed you on the graph where I was like showing a red and a blue line. Can this impact on the price go forever? So we discussed on Tuesday that this impact might not be forever, right? So we know that from Phillips curve that we have inflation or prices. Inflation is the growth rate of the price index, and we have unemployment, right? And we said it's Phillips curve is a negative relationship in the short run. So this is like Phillips curve in the short run, but we have the long run Phillips curve. Oh my God. We have the long run Phillips curve. All right. So an important link here that we discussed is this impact, like from the previous slide, I said like the Fed can affect inflation. But the changes in inflation, like here, right? The Fed can use its tools to affect inflation. But this can go forever? No, it cannot go forever, because in the long run, any changes in inflation or any changes in prices will not have a real impact on unemployment or output, right? Or real GDP. So the impact is just in the short run. In other words, we said that employment depends on output, right? And output depends on prices, right? So this link is always happening, like production, more production, I'm hiring more people, right? So this link is always there. But in the long run, the impact of prices on employment, on output, and in turn on employment is not there. And this is based on the data, right? And that's why we see a long run Phillips curve showing us that any increases in inflation or decreases would keep the unemployment rate at this point. In other words, the link is broken in the long run. So whether the Fed can affect the real economy, like whenever I talk about real GDP or unemployment, I talk about a real economy. Whether the Fed can affect the real economy forever, no, it's not forever, it's just over the short run. And that's why when we talk about the Fed two goals, price stability and unemployment, yes, it affects prices. Yes, it can affect prices even in the long run. So this link is there. but this link is not there, right? The link between prices and unemployment is broken in the long run. So that's why when we say that the Fed has two goals, right? We call it the dual mandate. People are now saying, or economists are now saying, why you should focus on two if we cannot affect one of them, right, in the long run. So people are now saying that let's just make it one goal, which is the price, given that we cannot, as a Fed, affect the real economy in the long run. All right, so also whatever we have said on the monetary policy in terms of manipulating aggregate demand and prices can also be said on the fiscal policy, the government. In other words, increasing government spending or reducing taxes in times of a recession would lead to an increase in aggregate demand, which would lead to an increase in the prices, right? And the opposite is true. Anytime prices increases, people are, or producers have the incentive to produce more, right? So output increases, unemployment falls, you're hiring more people, so unemployment falls. And again, we see the Phillips curve. So the negative relationship between the prices and unemployment in the long run. All right. The impact of government spending versus the taxes, it all depends on the tax multiplier or the government spending multiplier, on whether the economy is open or closed, right? Of course, an increase in government spending plus tax incentives or tax breaks would lead to an increase in aggregate demand. All right. I also mentioned that this impact is direct and strong because it's already one of the components of the aggregate demand equation, but this one is indirect because it affects your disposable income, or affects the person's disposable income, or it affects investment decisions through its impact on corporate taxes or capital gains taxes. It affects the net exports through the increase in tariffs, which is a kind of tax. All right. So this brings us to the end of the review session. Before I end here, I want to tell you two things. I will post review questions. Okay. And I will also give you the correct answers in a couple of days. So while you study, I want you to do this practice. It's non-graded, and you can it can help you to make sure that you're grasping all the points or all the links that I have just discussed. What else? We have also the practice question of the topic that we finished on Tuesday. I was hoping that I have the time to go over it now, but it doesn't seem so. But if you have done it and if you have a question on the things that you got wrong, I can answer it now. Like, you can wait until everybody leaves and you can ask me, or you can make an appointment and we can discuss it on Zoom.